Hey everybody. Well, today I want to talk about tidal habitats. And so this is part of our coastal habitats series. And this particular content area is three parts. So where there are going to be three different presentations on this subject area. So, as I said, we're in this coastal habitats area, and my objective here is for you to be able to describe patterns of zonation and species distribution in these vegetated habitats. I want you to be able to identify plant species that are characteristic of tidal habitats, and you've been doing a little bit of that in your lab. And then also you need to understand the unique features and adaptations of those plants, which allow them to survive in those areas. Okay, so let's start with salt marshes. We're surrounded by salt marshes in Galveston Bay and certainly there on Galveston Island. But I have to tell you, um, they're not historically, salt marshes have often been considered wastelands, lands of little or no value. And there is still some of that today, right? And there's still some of that. You see that in land conversions. These are areas that are often targeted to be filled to turn into other things like parking lots and subdivisions and that sort of thing. So, but the fact is, they do have significant values as we've talked about already, but as we're going to continue to see as this course unfolds. So this quote in particular just really makes me laugh. Such lands are not only unproductive of anything which can subserve on any important purpose, but they are productive of numerous evils. And so on. So anyway, I thought I'd share. I thought you'd find this interesting. So it dates back to the mid 1800s. So from our discussion last time that this area was certainly developing at that time, and more people were coming in contact with these marsh habitats. Beautiful white egret there in the marsh. Um, okay, so what are coastal wetlands? Well, we've talked about this already, so I don't think we need to go into a great deal of detail here, but they have these three diagnostic features or common elements. So they have water, they have to have water tolerant vegetation because they're going to be in the water quite frequently. The sediments, which are soils, submerged soils, are in fact inundated or saturated on a regular basis, and that those sediments also are anoxic. All right, so they're low oxygen. And again, this doesn't just apply to saltwater wetlands. It applies to a variety of types of wetlands. Okay, so it doesn't matter if you're practicing or working in Galveston or you're working in Wisconsin. Okay, it's, the features here are largely the same. The individuals will be different, but the features of those different species will be analogous. Okay. Um, Now, last class, you'll remember that really busy slide I have all the circles, right? And I introduced the number of different wetland types we have just around the Galveston Bay area. And one term I introduced was swamps. And it's important to be able to differentiate between marshes and swamps because you're going to hear those terms pretty frequently. And some people interchange them, but they're really two different things. Marshes are dominated by herbaceous wetland vegetation, whereas swamps are dominated by trees. In our area, those trees are largely cypress trees, or those tend to be the dominant species. Oftentimes, there's a lot of other species as well. But those swamps, the water is often very still, and they have very limited herbaceous vegetation. Okay, now, we also have the riparian forested wetlands that we've talked about, coastal bottomlands, and again, dominated by trees, and they have a lot of those same characteristics that our traditional swamps do, cypress swamps that are up in the north part of the Bay Area. Okay, so what are salt marshes? Well, again, things we've talked about. Salt marshes are subject to regular flooding by salt water. They're affected by tides, both gravitational and wind tides, but Salt marshes are not defined by flooding from storm surges. Okay, storm surges are kind of a unique circumstance that are not regular in occurrence, right? So some years you might have a storm surge or two, depending on how much tropical activity there are, and other years you might have none at all. Okay, so it really doesn't, those don't happen often enough to have a significant shaping feature to these marshes. All right. Whereas the regular tide flooding does, it does impact where these communities fall out, where they shape the type of species that are there and that. Many salt marshes are in estuaries or estuarine environments, meaning they might see salinities that vary. Um, and some salt marshes are very heavily influenced by fresh water. Okay, that's true in Galveston Bay. We have salt marshes that are in areas that are probably more fresh than salt on many occasions, certainly up in Trinity Bay and the upper part of um, uh, Galveston Bay proper, kind of near the San Jacinto River. Um, and then there are others that are fully marine. Certainly, the ones there on the in West Galveston Bay, I think in particular, are on the backside of Galveston Island, are a good example of that. Okay. In fact, I would suggest that the one you're seeing here in the picture is one of those. I think this was taken in I think it was taken in West Galveston Bay. I did not take this particular photo, but it was either taken in West Galveston Bay or perhaps Hitchcock. All right, so salt marshes tend to occur in cooler latitudes. All right, so you can see the equator running through this slide right here. And let me turn my laser pointer on here. Ooh, look how good I am at that. All right. So we've got the equator here. And right here, this represents the 30th parallel. Runs, actually, maybe just a little south of the 30th parallel, but it runs kind of through Beaumont. So just a little bit north of Houston and likewise down here through South America. Um, in this range, right around the equator, it tends to be warmer and tends to be more stable. Okay. So the environment is those temperature fluctuations aren't really all that substantial. I'm sorry, I didn't see on my own graphic here the Tropic of Cancer, Tropic of Cancer, and Tropic of Cancer, Capricorn. So not quite to the 30th parallel, which would be up to this area right here. So if I keep looking over here, I have a bigger screen, so it's easier for me to see. So, but the marshes tend to occur outside of those areas. And so those are represented by these black lines here. And that's because that herbaceous vegetation tends to be more resilient in the face of colder conditions and more fluctuant conditions. And it's that fluctuation that oftentimes has the biggest impact. The further north or south you go away from the equator, the more extreme the conditions get, from warm to cold. So in Alaska, for instance, up in this area, many years ago, I had the opportunity to do some camping up in the Katmai National Forest, watching, we were monitoring brown bear feeding. I had the opportunity to watch brown bears feeding. It was really neat. And frightening at night in some ways. But in any event, when we were up there in August, it was, 85 degrees or warmer during the daytime. But just a couple months later, that entire area was covered in snow, right? So the further you get away from the equator, the more fluctuant and more extreme those conditions get. And these herbaceous wetlands are just a little better able to tolerate those conditions. They're adapted in such a way that allows them to go into senescence and survive those winter periods, come back strong in the summer every year, be able to do all their important processes during that growing season. And so, mangroves in particular, and just aren't, they don't have that capability, as you're going to see. Okay, so you've seen iterations of this graphic before, but what you're seeing here again is the salt marsh, right? So if you look at this stretch here, when I use the term salt marsh, I'm referring to everything from the high tide line all the way out to the mud flats and seagrasses in those submerged areas. Okay, all of this encompasses a salt marsh. And those mud flats are in fact, or can be in fact, part of that area. So you'll find flood tolerant plants down here in the lower elevations. You'll find salt tolerant plants that may be somewhat flood tolerant up in the mid marsh, but typically their primary objective is to be salt tolerant. And then you'll find, because there's less stress in these high marsh and upland areas, you find a wide variety of plants, but they tend to have less adaptations that allow them to deal with flooding stress or salt stress. Okay, so this slide, by the way, sorry, I'm kind of zipping past that. It's essentially the same thing. And what I'm showing you here is that as you go from low elevation to high, plant species diversity tends to increase because the stressors are less as you get away from the water, right? Okay, so um, so when we look at these salt marshes, we'll start high and go low here. So the upland areas are characterized by very little saltwater flooding. You might get quite a bit of rainfall, right? And in those upland areas, you might have pocket wetlands or pothole wetlands that we've talked about, which will hold fresh water for some period of time, and eventually that will seep down into the groundwater below or evaporate, or may run off the sheet flow also in some cases if there's enough rain. But there's really very little saltwater flooding. So most of the salt exposure is going to be through salt spray or maybe storm surge in those really extreme events. So there's very low sediment salinity and low salt stress. These tend to be drier sediments and oftentimes are characterized as soils rather than sediments for that reason. And there's just very low flooding stress. Okay. So low environmental stress means you're going to have more different types of plants, more competition. So you're going to find a variety of different types of herbaceous species, brushy species, even trees in some instance. So a lot of competition in those particular environments because there's just not a lot of stressors to weed those out. Come on, that was good. Okay, so as you work your way down towards the high marsh, you'll find the high tide line. And again, one plant that really demarks that high tide line really well is actually the common name. It's referred to as high tide bush, but the scientific name is Iva frutescens. And this is a bush that has no salt glands, so it doesn't really have the ability to manage salt very well. So, really has very little exclusion ability. One of the key characteristics in terms of being able to identify it, makes it easier to identify, are the nodules on the leaves. I know you talked a little bit about this and we saw it in the field in your lab last week, and also the opposite arrangement of the leaves. Okay. Now, there are other plants out there that can grow in similar habitats that, at first glance, can be very similar to Iva frutescens. So, looking for these characteristics is key to being able to identify that. And you will find Iva that grows up into the uplands as well. But it does really like this. It does really like this high tide line. When it gets up into the uplands, it's oftentimes outcompeted by other plants. One of the ones that actually looks fairly similar to it is a genus Baccharis, and Baccharis has these really pretty white flowers, a beautiful plant. And again, at first glance, it looks a lot like Iva. So if you're in an upland and it looks like you've got Iva around, you might. I wouldn't rule it out entirely. But it's quite possible you've got some other species that are like Baccharis that again, look similar. Okay, so again, in my wetland delineation work over the years, this plant has been very helpful in giving me a real right off the bat. When I'm working in salt marsh areas and coastal areas, really right off the bat, okay, this is where I need to worry about what I am delineating from here, that direction, right? And I don't have to worry so much about this. So very helpful plant in that sense. Also, one of the things it does, I don't want to get too far off on this side here, but you know me now. So the these plants do provide really valuable roost habitat for birds during the migratory season as well. So they do offer some complexity to the marsh as a whole because they are shrubby. And that the herbaceous species, the grass species, really don't provide as much of. Okay, so the question here is ibofrutescens a monocot or dicot? So if you were in class, you did this on your clicker, and you would have answered B. It's a dicot. And there are a lot of key indicators here, and I would encourage you to go back and look at that from your lab. So it's in the family Asteraceae, and it is a woody species. So that woody component is really a giveaway that it's most likely a dicot. So as we go from the high tide bush down to the high marsh, these are areas that are typically only inundated by salt water during the highest spring tides. And you should be able to answer this question for your test. Okay, when do those high spring tides occur? If you don't know, go back and take a look at your notes from previously. So plant diversity tends to be higher in these areas than in the low marsh zones, again, because there's less inundation, so there's less flooding stress, and there's actually relatively low salinity stress because, again, it's not being inundated all that often. So you have less of those adaptations like parenchyma and a variety of salt management strategies. You'll see plants that have, variety, well, again, just a variety of different, we've talked about all those before and I don't want to spend too much time on it, but a lot of different salt management strategies in this area among the many different species that occupy these zones. So you'll see a number of different species often occupying the same area. These can be, one key species that you looked at in the lab last week was Spartina patens. That is a species that occupies that high marsh. You'll see other species that sometimes you'll see in lower elevations as well, like the Mysticula spicata, but patens tends to be one of those you'll see up in that area. When you get down into the next zone, this is a zone that has high salt stress, right? So this is referred to oftentimes as salt pan because you can see that there are open areas, right? So when you look at this, I'm pointing to the other screen, but you're looking at this screen. So if you look at these areas of open soil, right, and these tend to be sandy soils in many instances, these are areas, again, low vegetation. This is usually high to mid-level marsh, kind of in that area, and tends to be kind of on the lower elevation side of the high marsh. And it's characterized by very dry and saline soils. So you've got, when water does get up to that part of the marsh, it is evaporating. And so all of the water is evaporating to the atmosphere and it's leaving behind all of the other things that were in that water, mostly salts. It can be sodium salts, calcium salts, magnesium salts, phosphorus salts, any number of different salts, all in that salt pan, making it a very saline environment. This can be formed by disturbances or aided by disturbances as well. So when you get a slug of salt water in from a hurricane, it can just exacerbate the existence of those salt pans. Also, because it does see high tides, the debris that floats along the surface of the water in these marshes, and so you can think about small branches and sticks and leaf litter and trash and all kinds of stuff that gets deposited up when the tide goes back out. We call that the rack line, right? You'll see that on the beach a lot. When the tide comes in, leaves a rack line up on the dunes. That stuff, if that tide, the highest areas where those rack lines are, oftentimes won't see high tides again for some period of time, and that can actually smother the plants that are underneath them. Now, ice scouring is another thing that occurs. It doesn't occur here very often, but don't rule anything out. But I would suggest that the rack smothering of plants by the rack near and under the rack line is a significant issue that can lead to formation of these types of pans. Um, One of the things also is that there's inhibition that occurs because of the salt, right? So high salinity inhibits seed germination, right? The higher the salinity, the lower the seed germination, and that prevents plants from recolonizing. There's a lot of literature out there. I'll try to remember to put some links in here so you can read some of that if you're so inclined. But you will see benthic microalgae present. So in this image right here, you can actually see that microalgae, and you'll get these algae mats that will actually dry out if it stays dry for any period of time that are present on top of those on top of those flats. These also make really good they make really good roost sites for colonial water birds. A lot of colonial water birds are ground nesters, so things like terns, gulls, um, oh my gosh, I'm trying to think. Stilts are one of those. A lot of killdeer, brown pelicans are ground nesters, right? A lot of seabirds are ground nesting birds, and they look for these types of habitats. So, in terms of their value to other species, especially animal species, they have a very high value. You're seeing a skimmer in this larger picture here. These are really neat birds. They actually skim the lower keel of their bill in the water while they fly, and they catch fish as they're flying. It's a really cool thing to watch if you ever have the opportunity. I do see those when I'm kayaking sometimes out in West Bay. So again, really valuable habitat in habitat restoration, right? Some of the restoration sites that we have constructed over the last 25, 30 years actually incorporate analogous types of habitats into our restoration projects. So even on terraces, which are those berms we've looked at before, a lot of times the crown is left bare, or it may have some oyster shell on it, and that's to accommodate birds that have lost habitat just because of the overall loss of wetlands in the Galveston Bay area. It's to recreate the salt pans where these birds oftentimes roost or nest. Okay, so one question that comes up is a salt pan a steady state peak community function? In other words, is it going to stay unvegetated forever? Well, the answer is kind of yes and no. Um, Generally, once you get that high buildup of salt in those soils, it's really hard for other plants to colonize that. Now, there are a few that can tolerate that to some extent. Disticus spicata is one of those. You saw that in your lab. And what it does is it sends rhizomes, those runners, right? Those roots that can then establish new plants as they travel. They can actually they can send those rhizomes out into those salt pans. And so they can colonize them. And in fact, that along with Salicornia, which is a succulent plant, you'll definitely recognize. I'm going to show you a picture of it in a few minutes in any event. That's one of those plants that is highly adapted. It almost looks like a cactus because its leaves are so small, its flowers are so small, and it's very much adapted to moving salt in big volumes, right? And so these two species are species that you will often find in the salt pan environment. So things like the stickless here, here you're seeing some Salicornia down here. These species are often referred to as pioneer species because they can colonize very harsh environments that traditional herbaceous plants can't really do because the soil is either too toxic or there's not enough of it there to be able to colonize those environments. So this is a really good mechanism for them being able to do that. Because once these pioneer species move in, if they're successful in colonizing enough of this, they can actually modify the soils in a way that will allow other plants to start to colonize it. But it is a very long process. For those of you who studied ecology earlier in your college career, You've probably studied ecologic succession and have heard about other species of pioneer plants. This is a process that occurs in a lot of um, uh, disturbed land where pioneer species are usually associated with primary disturbance as opposed to secondary disturbance. So if you remember all that, then you'll understand this well. So again, the persistence really varies with the size, the conditions, the neighboring plant identity, a variety of different things. Okay. Um, let's see here. Let me come back to this. See if I can move this forward. Look at me. So here's the close-up of that Salicornia. Again, it really likes that mid-marsh. So you'll find this more in the mid-marsh, but again, it will colonize into the salt pans, which so salt pan kind of goes between the low end of the high marsh and the high end of the mid marsh, right? Um, it likes those transition areas. It thrives in these highest salt stress areas where there's just no flooding, not really any flooding stress. It tends not to compete well in those environments or as well in those environments. And so it's a succulent, right? So you told you it looked like a cactus. All right, so here you go. And so it has these jointed stems. So it's got really reduced leaves that are really more like scales, tiny little flowers. And these eventually, when they get aged, will turn red in some species and drop off. So that salt that's accumulated in those stems is lost as part of that. So these plants, again, very hardy in these particular conditions and very common. And we have a number of different species of them in the range around Galveston Bay. Salicornia virginica is the one I probably run across the most in my Okay. So from there, when you go from the mid marsh, you go down to the low marsh, right? And this is probably what most people associate with marsh when they think about marsh. And, they think about the low marsh. Um, so this area has the highest flooding stress, and really the salinity stress can be moderate to low depending on where that low marsh is located. In Galveston Bay, again, remember we've got a pretty wide salinity gradient that can range from almost zero all the way up to like 30 parts per thousand or higher. So where you find the low marsh can dictate how significant that salt stress is. There are a number of plants that are adapted to these environments, and again, those vary depending on how much salt stress there is. And I feel compelled to say something about salt stress here while I'm thinking about it, which is when you have multiple stressors in an environment, in these marsh environments, for instance, salt tends to be the most significant stressor. Okay, so if you've got all these different abiotic parameters that might be influencing these biotic communities, salt tends to be the one that has the really highest impact. That's not to say other stressors like flooding, for instance, or temperature, pH, dissolved oxygen, all of these other parameters in the water might not also have an effect because they probably do to some extent. But they tend to be smaller in terms of their overall influence than the salt does, individually and in some cases collectively, right? So in these salt marshes where you have a lot of flooding stress and salt, and you have this kind of moderate salt stress, then plants tend to be well adapted to salt. One of those is smooth cordgrass, which is Spartina alterniflora, right? Or as the name is undergoing a change now, as our genetic work is determining it's more closely related to the genus Sporobolus. So it's being renamed Sporobolus alterniflora. So if you hear me refer to Sporobolus alternifloras, it's analogous to Spartina alterniflora. This is in the grass family, the family Poaceae, and it is typically the dominant marsh plant in Galveston Bay, especially in the lower bay, below where Smith Point and Eagle Point and Redfish Reef, historic Redfish Reef was. Below that pinch point in the bay, this tends to be the dominant plant. Above that pinch point, oftentimes there's more diversity because That area tends to collect a little more fresh water from the river, so it tends to be a little fresher. And the further north you go, oftentimes you start to see other species that provide somewhat analogous functions like Scirpus species that they do some of the same things. They help modify sediments, they help oxygenate, they provide structure. There's all of that kind of thing, but they're a different plant. You actually have so these are rushes, and you have some similar rushes in the down in these salt areas as well. But in any event, the species sometimes will shift, and you'll start to see more freshwater species occupying those marshes because they don't have to put as much energy into maintaining the salt exclusion biologic functions, right? Okay, so this particular plant, the Spartina, it does have, so this does have salt glands on the leaves. You saw this in the field, right? There were actually salt crystals on the leaves as it was pushing that salt out through those salt glands. And if you were to do a cross section of the roots, you would see extensive parenchyma in those roots, right? So you would see if I can get my pointer over here. Here we go. So you would see these spaces that have opened up through the process of apoptosis. There are two different common physical forms of Spartina alterniflora that occur in Galveston Bay. There's a tall form and a short form. The tall form tends to occur in environments that are less saline, so more freshwater environments. And so you tend to see these more along creeks, streams, and even some bayous that are in the upper part of the bay where salinities tend to be lower. And they oftentimes occur in a relatively narrow band, right kind of in that area along the bay. So you can see here, this tall form down in image C here is up to this gentleman's waist, right? And so this is along an area that is a creek. It's predominantly fresh water, and so they can grow really high. And I know in some of the freshwater environments that I work in, I've had some of these plants, especially early in their growth pattern. We'll talk about that in here in a second. That have been taller than some of the students I've had out actually doing the survey work with me. So the short form tends to occur at higher elevations and tends to occur in saltier environments. So here in image B, you can see the short form here, and you can see how short that is. Now, morphology of these plants, so these, the physical forms, which one you're going to find, are affected greatly by salinity. That's why the short form tends to happen at higher elevations, because the higher up you go in the marsh, the more salt stress there tends to be associated with the soils. And salt inhibits growth and it inhibits seed germination. So that's the more energy the plant has to put into eliminating salt, the less energy it has to put into developing biomass, right? Now, I also will note that age is a factor, okay? These plants, when the seed first starts to germinate, so it falls off of it falls off of the plant, finds its way into the water, it floats, and then it finds a mud flat and it starts to germinate. When that seed starts to germinate, it's initially working off of, if you'll forgive the term, I just got back from Europe, takeaway. So it's got its little food packet inside of that cell, right? Inside of that seed, rather. And so it's working off of the energy in there to elongate and germinate and put out its shoots and its root to get down into the soil and anchor itself. But most of its energy initially, utilizing the food that's in the seed, right? Utilizing that energy is to get leaves out so that it can start harvesting sunlight so that it can then collect carbon dioxide and produce its own energy by producing biomass and sugars, right? So what we tend to see, and this is specifically true with the Spartina marshes, we see this a lot in restoration projects. When we first plant the plants, whether that's through sprigging, where we actually plant small stems, young stems, or where they're seeded, is the first year or two, the plants tend to put out a lot of shoot material, right? So if you were to pull the plant out of the ground and measure the biomass, the amount of living material that's above ground versus below ground, you'll find that they have these little tiny root balls. There's hardly any root associated with these plants at all. A lot of times I can pull them out with 2 fingers, but they have these huge stems. Sometimes they're as tall as me, right? And what they're doing is they're trying to collect as much energy as possible. They're putting that into biomass that's going to allow them to maximize that. And then over subsequent growing seasons, they start to put more energy into establishing those roots to stabilize the soils. They start to oxygenate, and then they start to utilize nutrients from the soils as part of their process, like any other plant. Okay. But that first year, it's really, and actually it's really almost 2 years, those plants are all about making above ground biomass. And you can see that in image A here, okay? This is one of my study sites up in Texas City. And so this is a recently restored habitat the Galveston Bay Foundation did. And these are students I have out doing post-construction monitoring. And what you can see how tall these plants are. And actually, there are seeds. These plants are seeding. So we did this in the fall because you can see under Philip here, you can see that this crown is bare. So I was showing you salt pan a couple minutes ago, right? And so part of this design of this restoration is to incorporate some of that salt pan in there to provide habitat for nesting colonial water birds during their nesting season. So this is actually very busy in the spring with colonial water birds. So in an effort not to disturb them, we tend on this particular site to do our monitoring in the fall. Not ideal, but nonetheless. But what I want to point out here is just how tall these plants are. And they're only in their second growing year. So, and they're shorter. They were shorter this year than they were the year before. Part of that probably had something to do with the drought, but part of that has to do with where they are in their life cycle, right? So this is actually a pretty salty area of Galveston Bay down there near Texas City. It's very close to the coast, very close to Bolivar Roads. And so salinities in here can get to be rather high, even 25 parts per thousand or more. And so the consequence of that is that that would inhibit the growth of those plants over time. And so I would expect that these plants will be short form or shorter form, at least, as they continue to go through their growing seasons over the next several years. All right, so another clicker question. Does the tall or short form of subarctinal alterniflora experience higher salinity stress? Which experiences higher anoxia stress? And which form is likely to have more parenchyma? Well, so if you think about this, salinity stress is going to occur at higher elevations, okay, those mid-marsh elevations typically, or in very saline environments. So that's typically going to be the short form, right? And it's going to be plants that are in flooded areas, the lower marsh, and those plants are going to suffer higher anoxia stress because remember, those areas, because they're underwater more, have less oxygen in the sediments, they tend to be more anoxic. And they also, as a result, develop more parenchyma to cope with that. So the answer to this would be C, short, tall, tall. Okay. All right. And which panel is a cross section of alterniflora from the low marsh zone? Well, if you look at the cross section of the root here, you can see that these have really prominent parenchyma, indicating that they are suffering from flooding stress, and thus they would be in the low marsh. All right. So let's talk a little bit about mangroves. Oh, looky here. So I don't know if I mentioned this before, but a lot of early scientists did not find much value in these types of habitats. But we know today that these habitats have exceptional value in terms of the resources that they provide that we depend on, right? especially to fisheries, but to a whole array of wildlife. They perform a lot of nutritive functions that are really valuable. Flood reduction that is really valuable, especially to shoreline communities. So they actually are not these valueless things that you see described sometimes in the older literature from the 1800s, when a lot of these things were really starting to be surveyed and evaluated. So I'm not going to read this, and you can go back and read this on your own. But to let you know, to show you how the science on these has really changed as we have learned. Okay, so what is a mangrove? Well, it comes from mangue, which means tree, and grove, which means stand of trees. You probably heard grove many times. These are salt-tolerant plants, so they're halophytic, uh, and they live in areas that are typically saturated with salt water, at least part of the time. Okay, they can live in freshwater environments. It is not totally uncommon to see them in freshwater environments. And there are tons of species of these, more than 68 species worldwide. Okay. There are 4 species here in North America and the Caribbean. Um, but there's something you need to be aware of with mangroves and that is that many of these lineages have developed independently at different times, and there are 30 different families of dicots that incorporate these. So they may not all have, so things that are called mangroves may not all have, may not be closely related in an evolutionary sense, and they may not even have the same mechanisms for stress adaptations. So, or even degrees of stress tolerance. So we're going to look at a couple that occur right here in our area that you're likely to see when you're in the field. Now, just the opposite of the herbaceous wetlands, those salt marshes, these mangrove stands, they tend to occur in these areas that are warmer and more stable. So you tend to see them kind of in these mid-tropical areas. Now, they do occur in the United States, mostly along the Gulf Coast. And so kind of in this area, right? So we're again right here. And they occur on the Gulf Coast in the areas that are often concurrent with those low salt marshes. When you look at diversity globally, the highest diversity of species actually occurs over in the Indo-Pacific and Indian Oceans. This is an area that is the sweet spot for these plants. So they are very well developed to tolerate the conditions there. And so you have a lot of different species all in these areas, as many as 40 in some locations. Um, Now, mangroves are, as I've alluded to, are well adapted to harsh environmental conditions, which are represented in these salt marshes. Um, but one thing they don't tolerate very well are freezes. And so freezing temperatures, even for short periods of time, can have significant impacts on these mangroves. So and I'll give you an example of this. One of my project sites is on Eckerd Bayou, and the site actually had a stand of mangrove trees just behind a stand of Spartina alterniflora. This is a restoration site. The mangroves were, I think if I recall right, are volunteers from other plants in the area. And so the seeds floated up in there, they germinated, you got these plants. Over time, we went for a long time where we didn't have any freezes. And those trees went from little scrubby things that were, really just a few inches tall to these really big trees, several feet tall. And they were starting to crowd the Spartina that were directly in front of them. And as they grew, they were shading those Spartina, and the Spartina were starting to evacuate. And the Spartina were actually getting out into deeper water. So this band of Spartina was actually getting thinner along that shoreline while the mangroves were expanding until we had the freeze in 2022. And that completely killed back most of those mangroves. There were a couple of small little mangroves that started to pop back out, um, probably from the very base of the trees. I didn't have the opportunity to really look at it very closely, but we did see a few new shoots coming out, but just a couple of them in just a couple of places the following year. And then we had another freeze. And since then, haven't seen anything happening there. So again, these trees, even short periods of freezing conditions, they just don't have any tolerance. And that's part of why you don't see them outside of these kind of subtropical areas, because the conditions get too cold in the winter and the variance between the warm part of the year and the cold part of the year is too significant. In fact, if you look across all of life on Earth, you tend to find less species diversity and fewer species overall, less species richness as you go further north or south from the equator, right? So mangroves are just part of that story, but this is one area that they're particularly susceptible. So you will tend to find what are sometimes commonly referred to as bonsai or scrub mangroves, and they have stunted growth, kind of like the short form of the Spartina alterniflora does. And this is often the result of very high salinity, again, which takes a lot of energy to be able to move that salt out of their systems or exclude it, right? Or where you have very nutrient poor environments, or where there are very cold conditions, either light freezes or periodic hard freezes that maybe don't last very long. So the plants are constantly going through this kind of intermediate disturbance where they're knocked back and trying to grow back and get another one the next year. And so it's always kind of this battle, right? Um, if you get occasional severe freezes in low nutrient soils plus high salinity, you'll get these scrub forms if you have mangroves at all. Now, again, they don't tolerate freezes very well, so it doesn't take very much. And I want to point out this picture right here because here's one where it went through a freeze and you've got a smaller specimen that's now trying to kind of regrow a little bit. And that's what we were seeing along my sites there in Eckerd Bottom. Okay. So in terms of zonation, you tend to find mangroves you'll find them kind of growing in this level that's between the mean tide and the mean high tide, but they're actually sending down prop roots that get down into the low tide area. So it's not uncommon to see prop roots in these areas. And so you'll find typically the mangroves closer to the water than other species of trees and brush. So for instance, let's talk about iberfrutescence again here for a second. You'll typically find mangroves lower elevation than the iberfrutescence, which is going to be right at that very high tide line. So it'll be Iva, and downslope a little bit mangroves, and then downslope further than that, you'll find your Spartina alternative. Okay. So one of the species that we find here are red mangrove, Rhizophora mangle, and it grows along the lowest edge of the shoreline, and it's characterized by heavily suberized roots. Okay, so we've talked about suberin in class before. That's that really waxy coating that's on the outside of the roots, and it blocks up to 99% of salt intake. And so that's a pretty good way of preventing salt from getting into your system that you would then later have to excrete in some way. Um, Now, again, they do have aerial root structures like I was talking about. So they do have these prop roots, and that's an adaptation to anoxic sediments. So those prop roots are covered with lenticels. Remember the little lenticels on the surface? And they do have parenchyma, those more open pores within the root structures themselves. So here you're seeing this is a really good example of the prop roots, right? And so that tide may come up and down a little bit, but the main part of the tree is actually protected by these prop roots here. So here again, an example of scrub size versus full size Rhizophora. You can see the scrub size in a very saline environment. You still have these prop roots here, but you can see how they're affected by those high salt conditions. And oftentimes, these types of dynamic environments in the intertidal zone sometimes don't have very good nutrient contents either. Can depend on the nature of the soils themselves, or sediments rather. But here you can see a full size one and how big those trees can get. So environmental conditions have a lot to do with how large these trees are going to be and how healthy they're. These rhizophora do utilize vivipary. We covered that a little earlier in the semester. So these seeds sprout and they actually emerge from the fruit and they elongate into anywhere from about 15 to 30 centimeter pencil-shaped kind of propagules. So you can see those in this right-hand picture here. And so you've got the fruit, and you'll see these on mangroves, and then you'll see the propagule will actually develop from the underside of where that fruit is as it kind of bursts through, right? And then, so what they're doing is they're elongating from the hypocotyl, right? And when they get large enough, right, the propagules will release from the tree and they will then float in the water. And rooting is initiated when favorable habitat is found. So when a lot of times that happens when they wash up on a mud bank and there's a place for them to anchor to. And if the conditions are right, then that will that plant will actually then start to root and you'll eventually form a small tree there. So here on the tree, right? So if you look at the different stages here, you can see on the tree the immature hypocotyl emerging from the fruit, right? So here's the fruit, here's that hypocotyl that's elongating. Here, again, this would be found on the tree. You can find the fully elongated hypocotyl. And then this is after it's released from the tree. And this is where it would have found good conditions and it'll start to root in. This portion is going to turn into the trunk and then leaves will sprout from where the top of the fruit would have. And so here's an example of those. Once they found those conditions and they're starting to actually then anchor themselves and form a stand of red mangrove. Okay, so rhizophora are in fact expanding. Now we've talked a little bit about the impacts of climate change. That is affecting distributions of plants. And we've talked about how abiotic conditions can affect what populations occur, where they occur within biologic communities, and they will, of course, move and colonize new areas and even abandon old areas. And this happens with plants, even though they don't have legs and can't move around or fins to swim with, they will find their way by this process of reproduction because their seeds float, they can move and they produce a lot of them. So the idea is put a lot of them out there and some of them are going to find a place to stick, right? And good conditions to do so. So as the conditions are getting warmer in the Gulf Coast, that is providing more opportunities for these plants to move more northward because they're not going to see freezes very or as frequently as they might otherwise have found. So that is a significant change that has been occurring over the course of my career. It's certainly been noticeable in the last decade. And so we're starting to see these plants more commonly along the central Texas coast. Now, the tree you'll most often see here are Abyssinia germinans. Sorry, that's a hard one for me to pronounce. Commonly referred to as black mangrove. And it actually occurs a little higher than Rhizophora does. The scrub forms are everywhere. And so you'll see these. And actually, I used this example when we were talking about the red mangrove, but actually the plants that were affected in my particular marsh there on Edgar Bayou were in fact these Abyssinia black mangrove. And but similar sort of issues, right? Neither of them are very freeze tolerant. The scrub forms are very small, usually 1 to 2 meters. The plants that we had there along Edgar Bayou were in the 2 meter range, so they were doing quite well. They tend to increase again in warmer climates. So in Galveston, it's not unusual to see these things in the 1 to 2 meter range. In Port Aransas, just a few hours south of us, you'll see them 3 meters or taller even. Now, that's not to say you won't find taller specimens in Galveston. I have seen specimens as tall as I am out along the in East along East Bay there. I'm sorry, along East Galveston Island down there towards Stewart Beach. And you're going to see some of those areas in one of your labs, and you probably will see some mangrove while you're down there. But I've seen specimens when I've had students out there doing surveys where we've seen some fairly large trees during periods, extended periods of time where we had a lot of rainfall, which tended to keep that a little fresher, so the salinity was a little lower, and because that area tends to be flooded quite frequently. Where we hadn't had freezes for several years. So it gave those plants an opportunity really to grow. However, if you go to places like Florida where they rarely have freezes, you can see Avicennia that are well over 10 meters, right? Now, I've not seen anything this size in our area, and I don't expect to anytime in my lifetime. I guess never say never, right? The Avicennia are characterized by pneumatophores. So um, when we talked about Rhizophora, we were talking more about prop roots, right? In this case, we tend to see more pneumatophores, and this species adaptation to a noxic setting. Okay, so instead of elevating the tree and then producing lenticels along the prop roots, in this case, these are creating pneumatophores, right? That are attached to root structures under the water that are poking up above the water surface. And they also have lenticels and rankoma, but it's a different type of root structure. So here's your prop roots, here's your lenticels, okay? So here you can see some black mangrove. You can see those pneumatophores can extend out quite some distance from the tree itself, right? So they can go, those root structures can be very significant. Here's another example of that. But again, fairly short, scrubby trees. I would estimate that this tree is probably no more than a meter in height. Their propagules are a little different than the Rhizophora in a couple different ways, and they undergo a process called cryptoviviparity, right? So here you've got this propagule that's about 3 centimeters long, a little bit smaller, and it's kind of lima bean shaped. Um, and so the difference between vivipary and cryptovivipary occurs in this fashion. Um, with vivipary, while on the tree, the germinating plant actually breaks out of the seed coat and fruit wall, kind of like we saw with the Rhizophora. With cryptovivipary, while on the tree, the germinating plant breaks out of the seed coat, but it doesn't actually come out of the fruit. Okay, so if you think about the seeds being inside of a fruit, think about a stone fruit like a peach, right? You got the seed inside of there and you got the fruit on the outside of it. Well, in essence, cryptovivipary occurs, you get germination occurring, but it doesn't actually stand out from the fruit itself. So it doesn't actually poke out of that fruit. The hypocotyl emerges from the fruit wall only after it's been released from the parent tree. So this is the difference between the Avicennia and the Rhizophora. Okay, so with that, we're going to pick up here next time, continue on this subject area. I want to remind you, I do keep student office hours on campus, and I'm certainly available to meet with you via Zoom. I know I've met with a few of you in that manner. So if you have any questions along the way, anytime, you're not bothering me, I'd like to hear from you. I'm happy to visit with you. So, and I think I'm a nice guy. So feel free to reach out to me. Your weekly quiz is out there, so that's going to be on taxonomy and morphology this week, and you need to be reviewing that for your lab, and you are going to be doing a series of field trips, including out there to the East Bay Lagoon, which is, again, you're probably going to see some mangroves while you're out there. So hopefully this was helpful. I want to remind you that our test week is coming up on the week of the 16th. So we're going to have an exam discussion and then an exam on the. So I'll look forward to seeing you then and seeing you next time.